Imagine you are watching a massive construction crew building a highway in sunny Southern California. It is November of 1992. The excavators are moving tons of earth to expand State Route 54 near San Diego. You expect them to dig up dirt, rocks, and maybe some old pipes. Instead, the heavy machinery scrapes against something completely out of place. A paleontologist monitoring the site signals for the machines to stop. Sticking out of the churned-up earth is a massive, curved piece of ivory. It is a tusk. A mastodon tusk, to be exact. Now, finding Ice Age megafauna in California is definitely cool, but it is not exactly stop the presses, rewrite the history books kind of news. The famous La Brea tar pits are just a couple of hours north, packed with the bones of ancient beasts. But this specific mastodon, which would eventually be named the Cerutti Mastodon after the paleontologist who spotted it, Richard Cerutti, was hiding a secret so controversial, so absolutely earth-shattering, that it would eventually threaten to tear up the entire foundation of human history in the Americas. To understand why this single pile of bones caused such a massive uproar, we have to look at the timeline we all learned in school. For decades, the golden rule of archaeology in the Americas was a neat, tidy story called the Clovis first model. The story goes that around 13 to 15,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, walked across a temporary land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. From there, they filtered down into North and South America, leaving behind beautifully crafted stone spear points. It makes sense, the evidence backed it up, and everyone was generally happy with this timeline. Over the last few years, a few discoveries have pushed that date back slightly, maybe to 20 or 23,000 years ago. But the Cerutti Mastodon site did not just push the date back. It took the date, threw it out the window, and set the window on fire. When scientists finally managed to accurately date the mastodon bones, using a highly reliable method called uranium-thorium dating, the numbers that came back from the lab seemed like a mistake. They ran the tests again. The results were the same. The bones were 130,000 years old. Let that sink in for a second. 130,000 years ago. At that point in history, our own species, Homo sapiens, were barely just figuring things out in Africa. We hadn't even made a significant push into Europe or Asia yet. Neanderthals were dominating the cold landscapes of Europe, and other ancient hominins were scattered across Asia. The absolute very idea of any human species, of any kind, standing in modern-day California 130,000 years ago, is like finding a functional smartphone buried in a medieval castle. It just does not belong there. It breaks every rule of migration we thought we knew. But a date alone does not mean humans were there. After all, animals die of natural causes all the time. A 130,000-year-old dead mastodon is just a dead mastodon, unless there is a smoking gun pointing to foul play. And as the team carefully excavated the site over the next 5 months, delicately brushing away the dirt of millennia, they realized this was not a natural burial. It looked exactly like a prehistoric crime scene. The bones were not laid out the way an animal naturally falls and decays. They were scattered, isolated, and most importantly, they were smashed to pieces in a very specific, very haunting way. Someone, or something, had taken the time to completely dismantle this multi-ton giant. Imagine stepping under the imaginary yellow tape of this prehistoric crime scene. When archaeologists and paleontologists map out a dig site, they do not just pull bones out of the dirt. They record the exact position, angle, and depth of every single fragment. And the map of the Cerutti site was immediately weird. The mastodon's remains were not laid out peacefully. Its massive thigh bones were resting side by side, almost as if they had been deliberately placed there. Even stranger, one of its heavy ivory tusks had been jammed vertically into the ancient mud. Tusks do not naturally plant themselves straight down into the earth like a flagpole. To figure out what happened here, scientists rely on a field called taphonomy. Think of taphonomy as forensic science for fossils. It is the study of everything that happens to an organism between the moment it dies and the moment it is dug up by a guy in a dusty hat. Taphonomists ask the hard questions. Was this animal dragged by a river? Did a pack of hungry dire wolves scavenge it? Did it get trampled by a stampeding herd? The experts looked at the dirt, which was fine-grained silt. That told them this area used to be a slow-moving, gentle stream or wetland. A slow stream does not have the power to violently smash apart a multi-ton carcass or jam a tusk upright into the ground. As for scavengers, there were no tooth marks, no gnawing from ancient wolves or big cats. Instead, the taphonomists found something much more telling: spiral fractures. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. If you go outside and find a dry, dead branch on the ground and step on it, it snaps, usually with a flat, jagged break. But if you take a fresh, green branch off a living tree and bend it, it splinters and twists, creating a spiral fracture. Bones work the exact same way. When an old, dry bone breaks, it cracks cleanly. But the heavy limb bones of the Cerutti Mastodon were covered in spiral fractures, meaning they were shattered while the bone was still fresh, shortly after the animal died. And it takes an absolutely monumental amount of force to shatter the femur of a mastodon. We are talking about bone walls that are inches thick. A predator cannot bite through that. A casual fall will not shatter it into 100 pieces. Breaking a fresh elephant femur requires a deliberate, massive, and highly concentrated strike of kinetic energy. This brings us to the most damning pieces of evidence at the scene: the stones. Lying right next to these shattered mastodon bones were 5 large, heavy cobbles. Some of these rocks weighed up to 30 pounds. Remember, this site was a gentle, slow-moving wetland environment. Geologically speaking, 30-pound rocks do not just gently float down a muddy stream. They had to be carried there from somewhere else. But these were not just random rocks. When researchers examined them closely, they found that pieces had been broken off the edges. They were covered in impact marks, scratches, and a type of damage that archaeologists call use wear. And they were positioned perfectly among the bone fragments. Picture what this means. The physical evidence points to a very specific, deliberate sequence of events. Someone carried heavy stones to the carcass of this freshly dead mastodon. They placed a heavy bone on a large, flat rock, using it as an anvil. Then, they hoisted another heavy rock, a hammerstone, high into the air, and brought it crashing down to crack the femur wide open. Why go through all that grueling, back-breaking effort? For the ultimate prehistoric prize: bone marrow. To ancient humans, bone marrow was like a high-calorie, nutrient-dense superfood. It is essentially fat and protein, the perfect fuel for survival in a harsh ancient world. The crime scene tells a compelling story of an ancient butchery site, a prehistoric barbecue, centered around cracking open massive bones for their nutritious center. The evidence seemed incredibly solid. You have fresh bones broken by blunt force. You have the blunt force instruments lying right next to them, complete with impact marks. You have a date of 130,000 years ago. The picture is so clear you can almost hear the rhythmic striking of stone against bone, echoing across the ancient California landscape. But if the evidence points to a hominin holding that hammerstone, it forces us to ask a question that makes mainstream archaeologists incredibly uncomfortable. Who exactly was holding the rock? If we assume a human ancestor was swinging that 30-pound rock, we are forced to look at a prehistoric police lineup that makes absolutely no geographic sense. Let's start with us, Homo sapiens. 130,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were mostly confined to the African continent, with maybe a few early brave explorers testing the waters in the Middle East. We simply did not have the numbers, the seafaring technology, or the global spread to be soaking up the California sun. So, scratch us off the list. What about Neanderthals? They were definitely around, surviving brutal ice ages in Europe and parts of Western Asia. But trekking all the way from Europe, across the frozen expanse of Siberia, and down the Pacific coast is a logistical nightmare even by ancient hominin standards. That leaves 2 more plausible, yet still totally mind-boggling suspects. First, the Denisovans. These are our mysterious, ghost lineage cousins who roamed Eastern Asia. We know from their DNA that they were highly adaptable to extreme environments, and geographically, they were positioned much closer to the Bering Land Bridge area. Then there is the ultimate wild card, Homo erectus. These individuals were the original human globetrotters. They left Africa nearly 2 million years ago, and successfully migrated all the way to Indonesia. Could a rogue population of Denisovans, or Homo erectus, have sailed, drifted, or walked their way down the Pacific coast 100,000 years before the history books say it was remotely possible? To a lot of experts, it sounded like pure science fiction. And that is exactly what the broader scientific community called it. You have to understand, in the world of archaeology, claiming you have completely upended the timeline of the Americas is basically painting a massive target on your back. The pushback was intense, immediate, and honestly, the skeptics had a really strong counter-argument. They did not point the finger at ancient, globe-trotting hominins. They pointed the finger directly at the highway construction crew. Remember those massive yellow excavators moving tons of earth back in 1992? The critics argued that heavy machinery driving over buried bones could easily create the exact same damage we see at the site. Think about the immense, crushing weight of a commercial earth mover. If it rolls over a buried mastodon bone that happens to be resting on a rock, that sheer mechanical pressure could snap the bone, creating those spiral fractures long after the bone was fossilized. And those hammerstones? The heavy machinery could have violently scraped the rocks against each other as it churned the dirt, chipping their edges to make them look like ancient, deliberately crafted tools. In archaeology, these accidental lookalikes are called pseudo-tools. Basically, the skeptics argued that this was not a 130,000-year-old prehistoric crime scene, it was a modern construction accident masking as a prehistoric mystery. The debate quickly turned into a massive academic tug-of-war. The original research team insisted the damage was ancient, deeply buried, and deliberate, while the critics confidently dismissed it as modern bulldozer damage. The problem with looking at a broken bone is that it is very easy to theorize about how it got that way, but incredibly difficult to prove it. The researchers realized that writing academic papers and arguing over dusty rocks was not going to convince a deeply skeptical scientific community. They needed undeniable, physical proof to show the difference between an ancient hammer strike and modern machinery. They needed to recreate the crime. To prove a bulldozer didn't create this prehistoric puzzle, the research team realized they had to do something a little unconventional. They had to go out and smash an elephant. You cannot just theorize about how a multi-ton animal's leg bone breaks. You have to see it in action. So, the team acquired the limb bones of modern elephants that had recently died of natural causes. Modern elephants are the closest living equivalents we have to an ancient mastodon in terms of sheer bone density and size. Then, they gathered heavy, naturally rounded river cobbles, matching the exact weight and geological makeup of the stones found at the San Diego site. Picture this incredibly surreal scene. A group of highly educated, meticulous scientists standing in a dirt lot, trading their delicate archaeological brushes for heavy rocks. They took a fresh, incredibly thick elephant femur and placed it carefully on a large flat stone to act as an anvil. Then they hoisted a 30-pound boulder high into the air, took a breath, and let it drop. The sound of stone impacting fresh elephant bone is visceral. It is a massive, echoing crack. But they were not just doing this to let off steam. They meticulously documented the results, and what they found was breathtaking. When the modern boulder struck the fresh elephant bone, it shattered, producing the exact same dramatic spiral fractures seen on the Cerutti Mastodon. They found the same impact notches, the same microscopic patterns of force radiating outward like ripples across a pond. But the absolute smoking gun was not just the bone. It was the rocks. Remember those critics who said the chipped stones were just pseudo-tools created by heavy machinery? The researchers took the rocks they had just used in their modern experiment and put them under high-powered microscopes. They were conducting what is known as use-wear analysis. Think of use-wear like the scratches on your phone screen, or the scuff marks on a pair of well-worn work boots. The pattern of the damage tells a distinct story about how the object was used. A rock tumbling down a river gets smoothed evenly over time. A rock scraped by a metal bulldozer blade gets deep, straight, violent gouges. But a rock used repeatedly to strike fresh, heavy bone develops a very specific type of microscopic bruising and microflaking along its striking edges. When the researchers looked at their experimental hammerstones under the microscope, they saw this distinct bruising. And when they placed the 130,000-year-old stones from the Cerutti site under that same microscope, the microscopic damage was a perfect, undeniable match. It was the exact same signature of bone-on-stone impact. They also systematically dismantled the bulldozer theory. When heavy machinery drives over old, fossilized bones buried deep in the dirt, it does not strike them. It crushes them under immense rolling pressure. That pressure snaps dry bones with flat, jagged edges, or simply pulverizes them into chalky dust. A bulldozer simply cannot replicate the physics of a targeted, high-velocity hammer strike on fresh bone. Armed with this arsenal of experimental evidence, the team spent years meticulously compiling their data. They knew that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Finally, in the spring of 2017, a full 25 years after that initial yellow excavator scraped a tusk in California, they dropped a scientific bombshell. They published their complete findings in Nature, one of the most prestigious and fiercely peer-reviewed scientific journals on the entire planet. This was not a fringe theory on a late-night internet forum. This was a top-tier academic publication boldly declaring that an unidentified species of ancient human butchered a mastodon in the Americas 115,000 years earlier than the history books said was possible. The publication was explosive. It sent shockwaves through the academic world, practically making archaeologists spill their morning coffee. It was the historical equivalent of claiming the ancient Romans had built a colony on Mars. If the Cerutti Mastodon site was a genuine archaeological site, it meant the entire story of how, when, and who discovered the Americas was missing its most massive, mind-bending chapter. Even today, nearly a decade after that explosive publication, the Cerutti Mastodon remains one of the most fiercely debated battlegrounds in modern archaeology. Some scientists look at the shattered bones and the microscopic bruising on those heavy stone tools and see absolute, undeniable proof of an ancient presence. Others refuse to rewrite the history of humanity without a body. They argue that until we find an actual fossilized skull, a jawbone, or even a single tooth of a Denisovan or Homo erectus buried in that California dirt, the mystery remains unsolved. And honestly, that intense, passionate skepticism is exactly how science is supposed to work. We should demand absolute certainty before we completely redraw the map of human migration. But whether you are a believer or a skeptic, let us zoom out for a second and look at the magnificent, messy, bigger picture. For the longest time, we had this habit of viewing our ancient hominin cousins as simple, primitive creatures, just clinging to the edge of survival. We drew neat, predictable arrows on maps, assuming these early species only ever migrated when the ice melted or the local food supply dried up. We thought we, Homo sapiens, were the only ones special enough to truly conquer the globe. But discoveries like the Cerutti site, along with so many other recent finds around the world, are forcing us to completely rethink that arrogant narrative. Picture what it actually takes to travel across the ancient world. What if the drive to explore is not just a modern human trait? What if the burning desire to see what lies beyond the next mountain range, or what rests on the other side of a vast, terrifying ocean, is a fundamental characteristic baked deeply into the DNA of our entire family tree? Whether it was Homo erectus building primitive rafts to cross deep ocean trenches in Southeast Asia, or Denisovans braving the absolute freezing extremes of the Siberian tundra, our ancient cousins were not just passively surviving. They were relentless. They were adaptable. They were profoundly, unyieldingly curious. The story of the Americas is not a closed book, safely locked away in a dusty university library. It is a living, breathing puzzle, and we are still out there in the dirt, finding pieces that do not seem to fit the picture on the front of the box. Every single time a researcher drags a trowel across the earth, or a construction crew digs a new highway trench, we run the beautiful risk of unearthing something that shatters everything we thought we knew. Maybe the true discoverers of the New World were not sailing ships from Europe. Maybe they were not even the Ice Age hunters of the Clovis culture, walking across a frozen land bridge. Maybe, just maybe, the first pioneers to ever set foot on American soil were a small, brave band of ancient, tool-wielding explorers, cracking open a mastodon bone 130,000 years ago under the warm California sun. So, what do you think? Are those shattered bones and chipped rocks the ultimate proof of an impossibly ancient human migration? Or is this all just a massive misunderstanding caused by a modern bulldozer? I want to hear your best theories, so drop your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed diving into this prehistoric mystery, do me a huge favor and hit that like button, share this story with a fellow history nerd, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our next journey into the past. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next one.